So good morning, everyone. I'm Beverly Carter, and welcome to our Death Series, An Exploration of Life. Today we have Meet the Mortician as our theme. So I am Beverly, and I'm just going to, I was commissioned in 2013, so I've been a notary for about 7.5 years. I have a master's degree in applied legal studies. I have lots of previous experience, which leads to all my PhDs in life. And you'll see on the right, I love my poodles. And here is the latest addition to my family. This is Abby, and she's 12 weeks old. We also have Sumo, who's 8.5 years old. He's a miniature. Abby will be a medium-sized poodle. So anyhow, so welcome. So a little bit about, the topic. Of course, I'm a notary public, and I deal with people. I make wills, I help them to do advanced care planning. And it's very common that a lot of people will come to me as part of doing funeral planning or health planning. And this is just part of getting this done. And so I have a chance to talk to a lot of people. I also see people coming into the office who are getting probate documents done. So at any phase of dealing with, some chapter in the phases of death. So I do have a chance to talk to a lot of people who are dealing with grief. I also do, as a courtesy, death certificates. It's one of my ways of giving back to people. Partly, those 3 PhDs I talked about speaks to a lot of my own experiences. And I've had some very difficult experiences around death. And I've always said that no experience is bad, but some surely are hard. And I think it allows me to have a different level of sensitivity, to be able to talk to very pragmatically with folks about the topic, because it's not easy for everyone. And so part of this this series is intended to sort of just explore different aspects. Certainly, when we're dealing with our body, we're talking about a very practical part, but there's a whole lot of emotion and things that go around that. This is not intended to be morbid. It is intended to be educational and informational. I go back to some of my earlier experiences. I know my mom really was not. She really had some challenges around death, and I think that had to do with her upbringing, perhaps a religious, very hard religious upbringing, and that I know influenced me. But 2 very distinct experiences. When I was 13, I attended my grandfather's funeral, and it was very dim and grim, and he was in a pine box and then got cremated. And the ceremony itself, the rites at the funeral home were fine, but the afterwards, the meeting, the tea and crumpets or cakes and sandwiches and stuff like that was difficult. And then I fast forward 6 years later, and my paternal uncle died, and of course it was a very difficult experience for me. I grew up in the town. He was always a part of my life. But the party afterwards was amazing. And it was really just like opened up a whole new way of thinking about things. So, I was also a girl who used to hold my breath when we drive past cemeteries. So it's kind of, it's always been a part of life. And our cultural influences and family influences have sometimes have a lot to determine how well we deal with this. And I think it's, I've learned that, you do have to deal with it at some point. And then I fast forward another 10 years in life. In my late 20s, I had to plan a funeral for my own baby. And that was probably one of the hardest experiences I ever had. But I also realized it was a very important part, the ritual of working through that. And sort of, with a lot of age and wisdom, I think it allows you to sort of be able to help other people, right? I mean, there's a role for just helping people work through. I don't think any of us really have our heads in the sand about this, but I do think we as a culture, aren't really that well informed anymore about our rituals, or they're changing. And so I just want to explore all of this. So I welcome Jade Simms. And Jade and I go back probably about very, very early on when I became a notary. We happened to meet, and I've followed him through a couple of different work situations. Um, Welcome, Jade. Please tell me a bit about yourself.
Good morning, Beverly. Good morning,
Morning.
everyone. Well, what is it that you'd like to know?
Well, so you're working in an industry that certainly doesn't, wouldn't attract everybody. I think that's probably fair to say. And so how is it that you got involved in the industry?
Well, that's not a typical story. The typical route is a lot of people actually take quite a bit of time usually getting their foot in the door, whether through, doing administration work or other parts of the funeral home for a while first. At least that's a lot of what I heard when I was going through school and from the other students and, my peers. I have a bit of a silly kind of background in that, and that's I received the wrong interview.
Oh,
So I had applied for, I used to own a cleaning company. So I applied for, cleaning, groundskeeping, driving, limousines, that sort of thing.
mhm.
And they didn't need any of that. And then, I got a call saying, hey, we'd like to interview you anyways. And I go in and, the questions got a little bit, odd. And I asked what it was that they thought they were interviewing me for. And they explained that it was for an apprenticeship position, which I wasn't aware of.
Okay.
And so I was honest with them and I said, hey, this isn't what I applied for, but I'm interested. And they seemed to like me. And we started the interview over. And that's how I accidentally fell my way into this. And it changed my life.
That is fascinating. Hey, there's a bit of serendipity there, perhaps.
Hmm.
So you work, just give a bit of a background here. You work with affordable cremation and burial, and I know very much in line with my thinking. They're a locally owned business, which I think in the industry is unique.
There's a large percentage of in locally owned businesses within the funeral profession,
Okay.
but there's definitely a very very large percentage where it's corporate now. And we're talking publicly traded companies, things like that. And yeah, no, they provide for very different environments and experiences.
Okay. Okay. Is it the only one on the Southern Island though that's locally owned?
No, there's a few others in town as well.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So it just so here's just a few pictures of. I understand this is a new facility that they've built.
Yeah, about a year and a half ago.
Okay. Okay. It's in the western communities, right?
It is, yeah. It's on West Shore Parkway, almost where it meets Soup Road. So
Oh,
we're kind of in a developing area here, but it's beautiful surroundings. I'm looking out the window right now and I see trees and fields, and it's really nice.
yeah. Great. Okay. Cool. Yeah. And there's okay. So well, let's talk about what funeral means, right? So I just took this off of dictionary.com. I think I've always found it maybe the connotations of having grown up with that. I've always found it a bit of a heavier word, but it is the standard word and language that's used. But essentially, funeral is dealing with the rites and rituals, and ultimately burial or cremation, or dealing with the body itself, right? So, is it a process, I guess, or it's not just the ceremony, but it's the whole process, isn't it?
Well, it depends really who's asking. Like for those of us inside the profession, a funeral, when we use the term funeral, we're generally referring to a more traditional ceremony where a casket's at the front of the chapel or church,
Okay.
that sort of situation. And, then we use terms like, celebration of life, for other sorts of things. But a lot of folks who come in, they just throw the word funeral out there, not realizing that they're grouping a whole bunch of activity into one definition.
Right.
Because
Right.
when people do come to us, there is a lot involved. It's not necessarily just, you're looking at cremation, you're looking at burial, you're looking at the final resting place for the body or the cremated remains. Are you having a celebration? There's all sorts of different things that come into play when people think of the word funeral, and a lot of folks don't really know what to expect when they come in.
Right. Okay. Some other words that maybe people may use, which sort of is, or think is related, certainly related, right, in that group. You may even have others. This is just, again, dictionary.com. I just thought it was interesting. Some of them in my mind would definitely lend themselves to certain philosophical beliefs, religious beliefs, if you like, or whatever, too. So like obsequies. So anyhow, now here's a big question that I really want to know. Who drives the hearse?
Well, usually a funeral director or a funeral attendant, and sometimes the apprentices as well. And they're all kind of grouped into the same profession, just with different levels of training and experience.
Okay.
So for me in the past, where I've done plenty of funerals, I'm the one who prefers to drive the hearse because I like to take that responsibility onto myself. However, I remember, when I was an apprentice, they would quite often get me to do it just because I had a lot of driving experience, and they trusted me with that task.
All right, and you can't have a lead foot when you're doing that, I imagine, right?
No, generally you have to have a pretty light foot. Even when you're on the highway, the expectations, even if you don't have a procession, that you drive a little bit slower than you normally would.
Yeah.
It's just a kind of a respectful thing to do. Stay in the slow lane. Don't, go trying to pass people. But when you are having a procession, so that's when you have all the folks following you, you typically do drive quite a bit smaller, and you do your best to try to keep everybody with you.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm just thinking in my mind, it's been a long time since I've actually seen a procession.
It's not as common out here. It's definitely more, the further east into Canada you get, the more common it becomes.
Okay, right. And I know there's a flag or some sort of a signage that will often go on the car. Used to be that I think everybody had their lights on too back in the day when you really could control that too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. So I just thought that, I mean, there are real people who are involved in all parts of these rites, these ceremonies, and that's just, I thought that was an interesting one. So tell us really, tell us what any funeral director would do. I know you're representing really not just your business, but you're really representing the whole profession. So if anybody's walking into any particular funeral home, they're all kind of a standard type of what you do. So please tell us about that.
Well, to go into funeral director, you kind of have to look at the word undertaker. And, it's an older term that we don't really use very often anymore. And basically your job was to undertake all the tasks and everything required in order to make the ceremonies and everything happen. So a funeral director doesn't have one specific job role. We wear a whole bunch of hats at once. Quite often, funeral directors are the one that go to the house or the nursing home in the early hours of the morning. They're the ones who are registering the death with the province and going over all the government paperwork. They're the ones printing the death certificates, doing the permits required for cremation or burial. And they're also the ones who are doing the treating of the body, the setting up of the ceremonies, whether it's a funeral or celebration of life, and getting pretty well everything lined up from officiants to music to cards and everything in between. So it's a lot of heavy hats to wear, but it does make sure that, each day is a little bit different than the last. And it's definitely a job that stays interesting, that's for sure.
I can imagine that it would. I mean, you're dealing with families, family dynamics, and you add grief into that mix, right? Because it can be anything from a very expected death to, and even when they're expected, it's still a loss, right? To very tragic, so I can see maybe why they tagged you. They saw something in you, in that you owned a business. So doing that, owning a business, you wear many, many hats, right? Mm-hmm. And you're dealing with many people, and there's a bit of, I wouldn't say sales, but there is you have to be able to connect with people, right? and use service, provide a service and have standards, right? And but there's the empathy and the compassion that not everybody would have, or have the ability, or the energy to be able to do that, right? On
Well,
top of
and one of my favorite parts of my profession is actually one of the hardest, and that's when you sit down and meet with the family for the first time.
yeah. Hmm.
Because for me, it gives me an opportunity to try to make, because I can't make things better, but what I can do is try to make things simpler.
Yep.
And it gives me an opportunity to connect with them. I get to hear all sorts of interesting life stories,
Yes.
but to put them in a position where they can feel a little bit more comfortable about the decisions they're making.
Yeah.
And I can ease them through the next processes because it can get quite complicated. And sometimes you just need a simple guiding hand to set you on the right path.
Right. Right. And I can certainly relate to that, because when I have clients who die, often I will get a call from the executor, and it's usually within the first 72 hours, and they're panicked. They don't know where to start often.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, that's right. And what I find is that they just need somebody who's been there and done this to say, hey, here's some simple things, just do this, right? Because they're usually exhausted. And one of the things I think a lot of people don't really realize is that, you know, um, honestly, I have these chats several times a week, right? Where that when somebody dies, there's all that happens before that, and that can be over a long period of time, or it can be very short and intense. um, but what it does is, as soon as somebody dies, it propels a whole lot of activity that a person needs to do, and usually that's the executor, or also the immediate family, you know the kids, the spouse, whoever is involved in that. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people really haven't prepared themselves for, because there's phone calls and people are calling you, and then you've got to plan. Like, there's this whole planning element of dealing with their body, right? Because that's essentially the first thing that what I tell people. I said your very first job as soon as somebody dies is to deal with their body. That's your first job. So um, so tell us a bit, about what happens behind the scenes, right? So if that's the first job and you're getting the call, and I'm an executor and trustee for a client, and I made that exact same call to you earlier this year. And I said, so and so she's gone, she's died, and she's in her room. And so what next? So tell us kind of what the process, because there's a whole lot that you do, and I think this helps people to know, how their loved one is being dealt with and treated through that process.
Well, it all starts with that first phone call.
Yeah.
So, we get the call and, we've been made aware that somebody's passed away. And so, right there, we begin collecting information. We need to find out, well, who are you? Who is it that's passed? Where are they? Who's our executor? Like, who are we going to be taking instruction from? That's very important
Yeah.
because that has legal, kind of precedence there. We need to know who it is that we can take instruction from in order to move ahead to the next steps. So after we get what we need for initial information, we then dispatch our team to basically go to wherever the person's body is to bring them into our care. And that can go a few different ways depending on where the person is. So if you pass away at home or you're in a care home, generally we can go there, either right away, or sometimes the family asks us to, slow down, delay a little bit. They want to have a little bit of visiting time first, or they want us to come right away. And so we get there, and there's a couple of forms usually to sign. We need somebody to sign off that we're there and we're doing the duty that's expected of us, but also that we're doing the proper identification checks and making sure that we in fact have the correct person. And so what we do is we have these little medical bracelets, the ones that they give you kind of in a hospital that clip on and you kind of have to cut them off. We use those, and then that has our personal information on there. So that way we can guarantee that we have the right person at all times.
Mhm.
After that, they usually come to the funeral home. And however, if somebody's passed away at a hospital and they usually get transported down to the hospital morgue at that point, what we need to do then is get, it's a little bit more complicated. We normally can't pick them up right away. We have to either meet or do it online, but get a form signed from a member of the family, preferably the executor, and generally it should always be the executor,
Right.
that states that we have their permission to have the person released from the hospital and then brought to us. I send that document over to the hospital, then I send my team, and then they get the person and then bring them to the funeral home. So, and then what happens then is once they're at the funeral home, they get their identity checked again. They go into, their information is put into a logbook, and there's so many identification procedures involved just to always ensure we have the right person. And then, we have our own morgue as well, and that's where they stay until final decisions have been made and we're able to facilitate them.
Okay. And there's a waiting period, and that's not something I really understood. And that may have changed over the decades, before a body can actually be either cremated or buried. Talk to me about that.
All right. So burial we can do right away, and there's actually a few different denominations of faiths out there that require a burial to happen, preferably within 24 hours of death.
Okay.
However, cremation requires a 48-hour minimum wait time. And the reason for that is that way, if the coroner decides that they need to be involved in any way, it gives them a window of time to act and then start making decisions. Because you can undo a burial. Even if somebody's buried right away, you can
Okay.
get them back. However, cremation is, of course, permanent.
Yeah.
And so there's no one doing that. So that's why the 48-hour window exists for cremation specifically.
Okay. Okay. I wondered. I had no idea. So it is cremation specific. That's right. So, and then, so I guess, in terms of dealing with bodies, you sort of touched on that, and it sort of leads to, what are some of the cultural trends? I see them in when I'm planning, whether somebody's in the Baha'i faith, or Catholic or Jewish. Speak to sort of some of the cultural differences that you attend to.
Okay. Well, I mean, one of the biggest trends I think we're all aware of right now is the whole COVID-19 situation.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
right now ceremonies are just not happening. And
Right.
if they are, it's usually very small, immediate family. They're much more intimate gatherings, I find.
Okay.
Um, However, cultural trends, there are some cultures that they have death rites and rituals kind of already in place. They know what to expect. They know what to do. They know what the next steps are. And so I have a lot of experience with the Sikh community, doing funerals with them, and typically they're all very similar to one another, and because they have specific rituals that are in place.
Hmm.
Same thing too, like going to church for a Catholic service. You kind of have an idea as to what to expect because again, those rites and rituals, they already exist. There's pretty well guidelines for them as to how they play out. I know when I'm going to a church, I know I'm probably not going to get blindsided by anything. It's all usually fairly typical, and it's yeah, it is what it is.
Right.
Um, However, it's when you get usually like secular families or families where they don't really have much of a cultural background with death, dying, any of that sort of thing. That's where things usually get a lot more unique and a lot more interesting because there's no specific death rituals already in place to guide them.
Right.
So it's almost like fumbling through the dark to try to find something that's meaningful that works for you and your family while still honoring your loved one. And I've definitely found, and it's not just me who's noticed this, this is profession wide, but celebrations of life are becoming more common than traditional funerals. So, as you mentioned with your family, the grim kind of somber funeral is far less common now, whereas the celebration of life is definitely something that's become more popular.
Yes. Yeah. I've definitely seen that trend for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, when my mom died a few years ago, one of the we were you know a very social but very quite an informal family from the interior, and you know what we ended up doing was just being around the grave site, which was where her parents were and her brother, and we just had everybody sort of talk about some memory or something. And my mom was known for her cooking, so we had recipes for everybody as part of the thing. um, and you know, everybody came up and said that was just, it was simple, but it was, they were so they said it was one of the most beautiful that they've ever attended, because I think it's authentic, it's of the people, right? And so really, I know you can do it's quite flexible. And and what about, you know, like, so the scope of the services, what would, you know, I certainly, when I'm talking to people, you know, in the wills, often will identify whether or not they want cremation or burial, or if there's any specific wishes. Honestly, a very common one is, I want my ashes scattered along Dallas Road here in on the Southern Island.
Mhm.
I'm not always sure that that's actually legally allowed, putting ashes in waterways, but nonetheless, people can ask for anything, I suspect. But a lot of people say, yeah, I don't want anything. I just want the cheapest, simplest, put me in a box, and just, I don't want any party or anything. So that would be incredibly simple, because there is obviously laws that require us to do something with the body. What would be some a more elaborate, you know, from time or just processes? What, give us an example of something.
Well, generally, when you kind of get into more traditional funeral territory, that's where things start getting more elaborate because, you know, at that point, you're looking at, you know, officiants, order of service, who's going to be speaking, who's presenting what,
Yeah.
you know, cards, registration books, flowers, food. That's when things start getting a little bit different because there's more balls to juggle that are in the air.
Sure.
And, you know, and I mean, again, every community is different, but I can't speak for myself in this regard, but you know, I do know funeral directors who you know work primarily on the mainland, and you know, it's not uncommon to have a funeral that's $50,000 or more by the end of it. Whereas the majority of what you know I find on the island here is we do a lot more what we call direct disposition, and that's as you said, like you know, very basic, simple. We're just looking for the basic disposition of the body, cremation or burial, and the family generally, if they do anything of their own, they're doing it on their own and not with the involvement of the funeral home.
Right.
But again, like you know, from something as basic and simple as that to you know, as it's like planning a wedding. You know, some folks, you know, they do it in their backyard, they keep it nice and simple, and sometimes you're renting a hall or a church, and there's several hundred people there, and there's a lot to keep organized.
Yeah.
And it really depends on you know each family. Everybody's different. There's no right or wrong way to do it.
Right.
But it's just you know whatever this process is, it should be hopefully helpful in some way to those attending. But more importantly, the immediate family involved. You know, whatever helps them grieve and kind of move on to the next steps of that grief.
Right. So I'm just curious if I do often get requests just after somebody's died from existing clients or their executor, or just before, and they want to provide a copy of the will to the funeral home, and I presume that's to confirm who's in charge, right?
Yes.
You can have, like, mom dies and there's 4 kids, which one's in charge, right? Because it's not, I guess from you, it's not always apparent. And I could see there could be some legal issues if somebody takes over and they don't actually have the authority.
Hmm.
Um, what about if somebody says, I want cremation? Would the family then be allowed to do a burial? Like, are there laws around that? Or if they said, I want burial, and then they choose cremation, does it matter?
It really depends on what it's written down as. If it's actually stated in the will, that's what you should be doing.
I agree.
Um,
Yes.
and you know, and most funeral professionals will adhere to the wishes of the will. They'll say, like, it clearly states here,
Yeah.
you know, mom wanted to be buried. So, you know, cremating probably isn't something we should do.
Right.
Um, unless you have some other sort of documentation that says otherwise.
Right.
Which actually brings up an experience I had where their will, which was very old, did say that they want to be buried, but they had a prepaid contract with the funeral home
Okay.
that uh, was much more recent, that had their signature on it. It stated very clearly on there that they wanted cremation. So now the pre-arrangements, which was the more recent document,
Right.
trumped the instruction in the will.
Okay.
So it's just, and the point I'm trying to get with that is to always make sure that you keep your wishes updated and written somewhere, because you don't want your family second guessing what your wishes are. But you know, in regards to who can make those decisions and the order of kind of hierarchy, so to speak, is the first person is always the executor.
Right.
But people don't always have a will. So then it kind of goes down the list of the various next of kin. So spouse is the next person. If there's no surviving spouse or the person was never married, goes to kids. No kids, parents, so on and so forth. And it's all outlined by the Vital Statistics Act.
Right. Yes. Oh, that's interesting. And that sort of there's parallels in health decision making if somebody's lost capacity or those sorts of areas too. So that's something I did not know. So you kind of bring up the pre-planning, and I'm just going to say one of the most common comments I get, and this is usually for either the executor or immediate family member, they are so grateful when somebody has taken the time to do pre-planning. So prepayment, whether it's the cremation or just actually putting all of those, ideas together, because there's a whole lot of information that's required when somebody dies, and it may not be top of mind, right? So, and some of this is required, I think, for the Vital Statistics Agency. So if, like when my mom died, I needed to go digging to find out where my grandfather was born. I thought I knew where he was born, in Denmark. But as it turns out, the town I had was wrong. That was just one of the places he lived for a long time. Actually wasn't where he's born, as I found out after. And so just speak to some of the pre-planning. People can go through and prepay and pre-organize. Talk to me about that.
All right. Well, it's, just kind of as you said there's a lot of information that we generally need. And pardon me. So a lot of what you said there. So, information that we need, are things like, your care card number, your social insurance number,
Okay.
your full legal name, no nicknames, no short names, your date of birth, where you were born. We'd like to know, what sort of industry are you involved in? What sort of work do you do?
Right.
For how long? Your parents' information, some spouse information, and then your executor's information. And the reason for that is because all that information is required by Vital Statistics for us to register a death. And to have all that information on hand ahead of time is a great help to your family, because then they don't have to go and start digging through it all. You put down on paper yourself that your mom's legal name, including maiden name, which is something that's quite often forgotten these days. Where they were born, where your father was born,
Right.
those sorts of details. And any funeral home will be able to provide you with a Vital Statistics worksheet to fill out. And some funeral homes have their own variation of it, but they can be printed from the Vital Statistics website as well. So that's something that any funeral home should be able to help with.
There. Yeah, it's a lot of work, and I know that is definitely something that a lot of people aren't prepared for. They're exhausted, they have grief, and it just seems very onerous, and they're dealing with all these phone calls, calling people calling them, organizing things and whatnot. So I just go back to it is amazing how much that comment comes up just in a general conversation when I'm asking people, about their experience and how they are. And they'll say, I'm very grateful that my mom or my dad or my uncle, whoever, has done that pre-planning, right? And
Mhm.
can you do, I also sometimes will recommend to people, if they're aware that somebody is dying, whether they're, ideally, if they're aware, they should be involved in it. But if they're not, the executor can start this process before getting some of this set up, this detail. So you don't have to wait until somebody dies to do it if that person hasn't done any pre-planning, but the executor certainly can. So, and I think that's something that a lot of people are not aware that's an option to them. So, um, and what about when should people start preparing? Any?
There's no, there's, I would suggest anybody at any point of their
Right.
life to consider it.
Yeah.
And there's a few benefits usually involved.
Yes.
Generally, when you prepay, even if you don't actually, let's not even touch on prepaying yet.
Yeah.
Even if you just get the vital statistics information set aside, that is a great help because
Okay.
having that sort of information is good, not just for, in case you ever pass away. It's good genealogy information to have handy as well. You never know when that might come in handy later on down the road to another member of the family.
Right.
Um, by but the benefit to having it set up ahead of time, and this is where kind of paying for it comes in mind, is it locks down most of those prices. So if you
Right.
pay for the professional services of a funeral home in order to register the death, retrieve the body, all that sort of thing,
Hmm.
those prices don't go up over time. So basically, it's an inflation-proof investment. So that's kind of the benefit too, because obviously the younger you are when you do that, the more savings there will be, you know, later on.
Right.
Um, at a because where I am right now, we're newer, of course, but where I was before, they've been around for decades. And I was doing activating pre-arrangements for, you know, in 2015 where they wrote them in the 80s,
Right.
and they paid, a handful, a few $100s for something that would cost thousands now.
Right.
And that same kind of tactic still applies. Yes, you can pay now, but that means you're not paying that much more. Your family's not paying that much more in the future.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the benefit too with pre-arranging is quite often financing is an option. Whereas once the death occurs, generally that all needs to be paid in order for us to do everything.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Yeah, because I think that is when I'm talking to people about who they're appointing as an executor, I think it's prudent for them to like some people are aware and others aren't that there's quite a bit of expenses that can take place right at you know, and this is one of them. I don't know generally what the most simple cremation in a box would cost without any party or farewell or celebration of life, but um, I I do know that a lot of people are not prepared for that, right? Even if it's $2,000 or three. I mean, it's in my mind, it's easy to say you can spend $5,000 in the first week or two, just without thinking, right?
Mhm.
Because there are other expenses. Maybe a person rents; they got to continue renting, right? And so executors, this is an advantage of pre-planning and prepaying, is that it's done, it's one less expense, and it's a necessary expense that the executor can get or the family get stuck with. They'll eventually get reimbursed, but if there's no cash in the accounts of that person, they might own a $500,000 condo that's all paid for, but that doesn't translate to cash. Can't pull money out of that to reimburse yourself. So there may be a bit of a financial reason that you want to do pre-planning, because it helps your family a bit, right?
Well, and there's also a bit of a psychological reason too. I mean,
Yeah,
it put your wishes down in a contract, so it's kind of hard to dispute, what it is that you want.
yeah,
So,
that's fair. Yeah,
and then the other thing too is it takes that decision making away from your family, and there is such a benefit to that. They don't have to think about whether you want to be buried or cremated. They don't
yeah,
have to think about whether you wanted a service or not, or any of these sort of things, because
yeah,
they have a document that outlines what your wishes are already.
yeah.
And I've done plenty in the past where pre-arrangements were never done, and the family has no idea where to even begin because it was never discussed.
Yes,
And
that's very common. Yeah,
it's something that a lot of people don't want to talk about, especially with their families.
right.
Um, but all that does is complicate the whole process a heck of a lot more once
Right.
the death occurs, and nobody knows what to do.
Yeah, yeah. And that's very common. That's the same that I see experienced in wills. Or if somebody has a sudden health change, right? I mean, aging
Mhm.
is a risk, right? We're all going to die, and none of us know, none of us have the crystal ball of how long it'll take to get there or when. And I always say, just speak openly about this. At least tell people who are close to or likely in a position to make whatever kind of decision or planning. Just talk to them about this, right? And they can't unhear it. It's better that they hear it from you, and it's better if you do it yourself. So
Mhm.
um, I also find that that's again, it kind of speaks to my reason for doing this series, is just giving people the chance to talk to somebody, right? And I have experienced some of the hardest experiences you can imagine, and I think it's because of that that I really can totally connect with people, because I've been there, and I get the challenges that you have. So um, and all I can say is just, things can happen unexpectedly. I've had that multiple times. And so talk to me a bit about the Memorial Society of BC. This comes up often where my clients will say, oh, I belong to the Memorial Society of BC. Well, what is it?
All right. Well, the Memorial Society of British Columbia, they're pretty, and there's various associations all across North America, and I'm sure other parts of the world as well. But ours is Memorial Society BC, and what they do is you sign up for membership with them, and I don't know exactly what the fee for that is, but I know it's affordable. It's less than $60, I believe.
Okay.
And what they do is they take your information on file, including all that vital statistics information that we touched on earlier. They keep a record of that if you'll give that information to them. So that way it's on hand.
Okay.
And the other thing that they do as well is it guarantees discounted pricing with various funeral homes that they're partnered with. So, for example, like I know that the funeral home I work with, Affordable Cremation and Burial, we are partnered with the Memorial Society BC, and that allows for discounting on our, final on our contract items. But what that is, and the other benefit to that as well is if you sign up with the Memorial Society of BC, you can then pre-arrange and lock down those prices at a discount as well. So, you can ask them, well, who are the funeral homes that you're partnered with? And they'll give you a list of various places you can go to local in your area. And you contact them, you let them know, hey, just so you know, we're a member of the Memorial Society, we want to pre-arrange. And, then you get, even more bang for your buck, basically, is what it is. So, it becomes much more affordable.
Okay.
And yeah, but the benefit too is they can give you a card to put in your wallet or documentation. And your family knows that, if they don't know which funeral home to use, they can call the Memorial Society. And if you don't have things already prearranged or prepaid for, they will then guide you to a funeral home, that they're partnered with, and then kind of set you on the right direction. Because
Okay.
at least then, if you're paying out of pocket because it's not prearranged, those
Mhm.
discounts are in place.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for that. I never
Mhm.
really quite knew that. I think we've kind of talked somewhat about this, how to prepare to deal with a funeral home. We've talked about the types of information, that vital statistics agency worksheet. I wasn't aware that that existed. I
Mhm.
do know that the funeral homes always have a really good information package. Um, that also tells you first steps to deal with um, in terms of when somebody dies. So there are things like claiming a CPP benefit, and it has all of that key information, canceling a passport or uh,
Mhm.
health number or those sorts of things. So that's very good. So when really, I imagine dealing with a funeral home, you can go online and find out about them through a website. But if a person, I guess, do they need to call, make an appointment? Is that the best right now?
Yeah.
Or are you doing Zoom appointments?
Um, Calling ahead of time, even prior to this whole pandemic situation, it's better to call because we want to make sure that we have staff available to help you. Because
Right,
keep in mind, funeral directors, they're out in cemeteries, they're out in churches, they're
right.
planning, they're all over the place, and
Yeah,
there's not necessarily always somebody immediately available.
yeah.
So if you just walk into a funeral home, we don't want you to have to go through the experience of driving all the way to us to walk in to find out that there's no funeral director on site to give you a hand.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's always best to call and make an appointment, just like you would with, like, your dentist or doctor or lawyer. You
Right.
don't just walk in.
Right.
It's
Right.
good to make an appointment to make sure that you're being served as best as possible.
Sure.
Um, but most information, especially now during the pandemic, a lot of it, we'll take a lot of the information on the phone,
Yeah.
and a lot of places are adapting and they're doing things digitally. So,
Okay.
we give
Mhm.
you the information package, through an email. We'll have you sign the documents digitally. This
Yeah.
option to come into the funeral home is still there, but we've expanded the options in order to make sure that everybody's as comfortable as possible.
Okay. Okay. Good. Great. And just a quick thing, this is something that dealing with the body that comes up. I have other at the bottom. I think most people are aware of cremation, burial, but can you talk a bit about, green burial? What other options are available to people? What that looks like?
So, green burial is like burial, but there's just more rules in place. And not all cemeteries offer green burial space. I know Royal Oak Burial Park does.
Okay.
I know they have a specific section, and once it's filled in, they bring in plants, shrubs, trees, and they let the whole area grow over. I've done burials there a couple years apart, and you can't even recognize, where I've done the last one because it looks like the forest. It's really beautiful.
Right.
Um, and so there's usually rules as to what you can be buried in. So a shroud, or they don't want any metal, they don't want any plastic, they don't want anything that can't biodegrade.
Okay.
So there's just more rules and regulations, and basically for more of that information, it's better to contact your local cemetery because
Right.
each cemetery has their own personal
Right.
rules and what's allowed and what's not allowed. So
Right.
it's I don't want to speak out of turn. It's better to contact them and find out what's
What's
um,
available there, right?
exactly.
Okay.
And as for other interesting, so right now in BC, cremation, burial, green burial, those are the only options we have available to us.
Okay.
A growing trend across Canada and the States, it just seems to be slow to come to BC, is something called alkaline hydrolysis.
Okay.
And what that is the body is placed into a chamber, which uses a combination of pressure, the water, lye, to break the body down. And instead of cremating them as you would with fire, flame,
Right.
uh, the the process breaks the body down into a liquid state, and then leaves skeletal remains behind.
Okay.
Uh, Now, the kind of, I guess you could call it the liquid, waste, which was the body,
Right.
um, that is safe to just kind of put down a drain. I mean, it's basically been processed to the point where it's sanitary. You don't need to worry about it.
Okay.
It's no different than what goes through our systems as it is.
Right.
The skeletal remains are then processed much as you would after a flame cremation, and those can be put into an urn and just treated the same way. But
Okay.
it's just a different way of breaking down the body. And of course, there's and all over the world there's different cultural practices like Tibetan sky burials, where they basically allow the birds to do it.
Okay.
Things like that. It's it's quite the rabbit hole to kind of fall down if that's something you want to get more information on.
Okay. Yeah, curious. I've had some clients bring it up in recent months, and
Mhm.
sometimes that's the first time I hear about things. But I'm always, again, if some are talking about it, then others are probably thinking about it as well. Probably the most common request I get outside of ashes on Dallas Road would be, I want the most environmentally friendly disposition of my remains, right? My body, I want to be the kindest to the earth. So that's and that is changing. I'm certainly seeing a lot more of those kinds of requests too.
And even right now, that's a tricky question to answer because
Yeah,
you know what, cremation. The thing is, though, is burial is that space where your body is that can't be used for anything else. That is
right,
designated perpetually as your space.
right, right.
So, however, a green burial, I mean, you're just biodegrading. There's nothing really awful about that. And but it's when you're putting, a steel casket in the ground that's been hermetically sealed and you're embalmed, so that way you're going to be preserved for the next 500 years. Uh,
Yeah, right.
but
Yeah.
at the same time, when you look at something like cremation, that requires fuel, quite a bit of fuel to make that cremation process happen, to get that all done. So there's no perfect environmentally friendly option. You kind of have to weigh the pros and cons of each, and what works best for you.
Right.
But not that there's anything wrong with any of them. I mean, my personal choice, I don't mind the idea of green burial.
Right.
But at the same time, though, I don't mind the idea of cremation either. But green burial is kind of what I'm leaning towards for myself at the moment. But who knows what will change in the future?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's evolving, and in a way, I mean, we used to do the shroud. We, as 100 years ago, that would, or maybe longer than that, but wasn't uncommon not that long ago in the history of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so it's just sort of fascinating. I just have a like another question. When you're dealing with cemeteries, so you're one business. What happens if somebody lives here but they're in Mexico and they die? Like, how do you help in getting their bodies repatriated? How
We
does
do.
that?
That can be tricky as well.
Yeah.
So depending on where in the world they die, you're dealing with probably a funeral provider at wherever their body is. Sometimes you even have to deal with embassies and things like that, and it can be quite a messy process and expensive as well.
Yes.
Because if you're having a full body brought back to Canada from elsewhere in the world, it's going to cost you quite a bit of money. Being cremated and then sent over is different, but that's not always an option, or it's not necessarily what you want or what the person's wishes were.
Right. Yeah.
So a lot of funeral providers, they can provide something called a travel protection.
Okay. Yes,
And
I've heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's basically an insurance policy that you pay for. I believe it's a one-time fee of a few $100s, and it follows you for life. So that way, if you die away from home, this insurance policy will at least cover the costs of getting you back.
Yeah. I know that happened to one of my best friend's parents in this U.S. and it was an incredible process to get the body back and incredibly expensive, right? Mm-hmm. They didn't have the insurance in place, but yeah, so it's like, And what about different cemeteries in and around, like, so you can deal with the body here, but what if they want to get buried in the Okanagan? Or
I've done it. So at that point, you're going to have two funeral homes involved. You're going to have the sending funeral home and the receiving funeral home. Okay. So, for example, I would then get in contact or help the family get in contact with a funeral home on the other side, and they would be the ones to retrieve the body from the airport or wherever, and I would be responsible for making sure that body ends up on a plane and then getting to its final destination for them to pick them up.
Okay, so they go by plane, not by car.
Well, it depends on how far you're going.
Okay.
We've, for example, like if somebody wants to be buried, a little ways out from the, greater Vancouver area, we'll just drive. But if somebody wants to be buried over in Alberta or, say up in like Prince George or somewhere like that, then we're probably looking at flying options or getting as close as possible to there and somebody having to drive the rest of the way.
Right. Okay. Well, great. Good. Well, we're at the end of our time. I just is there any parting thoughts there or information that you wanted to provide to people? Obviously, here's your contact information if somebody was interested to talk to you specifically. Any parting thoughts?
I welcome all questions. If anybody ever wants to email me, my email's just up there on the screen. Jade@affordablecremationandburial.ca, and I'm more than happy to answer questions. I'm all about death education. I wish we had more time because I could talk about this all day.
Yes.
But one thing that I really want to stress is the importance of, even if you don't pay for it, put something down on paper. Have your family aware of what your wishes are, or somebody aware. Just that way, it takes at least some of the guesswork out of the picture for when that time comes.
Right. Yeah. And I've actually picked up a good tip from you with that the Vital Statistics Agency worksheet. I will start putting in my package when I'm giving wills over to people, just so at least they've got it, right? Because it would give them a clue of something that they would need to do. So thank you for that. Well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate our professional relationship. I certainly have used you directly, personally, and I'm always impressed with the level of professionalism and service. And so thank you so much. And I wish everybody a great day. And that's it. Thanks, Jade. Okay.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great. Okay.
All right.
Bye.